Welcome to Exploring AI Matters. This podcast series, previously known as Mind the Gap, Dialogues on Artificial Intelligence, will continue to appear in the ABA series to the extent that. In addition, all of the episodes, old and new, will now appear under our new podcast name, Exploring AI Matters. Thank you.
Humans tend to think of intelligent behavior as originating in the brain. Analogously, we think of artificially intelligent behavior as originating in a computer central processing unit. In today's episode of Mind the Gap, Dialogues on Artificial Intelligence, we shall discuss intelligent behavior emerging from swarms of simple robots. In nature, we see coherent cooperative behavior from collections of animals like colonies of termites, colonies of ants, and hives of bees. Scientists have studied these organisms and their behavior for a long time, trying to understand how these animals coordinate their behavior so effectively, given the simplicity of their nervous systems. Computer scientists began to explore swarm intelligence in the 1990s. Our guest for this episode is Lieutenant Colonel Jason Cody from the United States Military Academy at West Point. Colonel Cody's doctoral research at Vanderbilt focused on swarm intelligence and its potential and practical applications in human swarm teams. Jason is an assistant professor and active duty officer teaching in the Academy's Department of Electrical Engineering and Computer Science. As a career Signal Corps or communications officer, he has deployed to Afghanistan, Iraq, and Kuwait. In addition to his distinguished service in the Army, he has authored and co-authored numerous academic publications in artificial intelligence and is a graduate of the Command and General Staff College. Hello, I'm Roland Trope, a national security lawyer.
And I'm Charles Palmer, a computer scientist. We are your hosts for this episode of Mind the Gap, Dialogues on Artificial Intelligence.
In addition, we have two more hosts.
Hi, I'm Mama Adams, a national security lawyer.
And I'm Mark Donner, a computer scientist.
Each episode will be led by two of us, with the other two adding impromptu questions and comments as the spirit moves them.
So, Lieutenant Colonel Cody, thank you for your time today. It's good to see you again.
Before I go in any further, though, I do want to throw a disclaimer. So, of course, I am, assigned to the United States Military Academy at West Point. But I do have to clarify that I'm here in this interview expressing my own personal views in my personal capacity. Any of the opinions or views or conclusions that I share today are my own and are not to be interpreted as representing official policies or endorsements of the United States Military Academy, the United States Army, the Department of Defense, or the United States government. Sure.
So help us understand this intelligent coordinated behavior in swarms of animals.
Very excited about it. All the animals out there coordinate in some way. Humans coordinate, of course. You can think of higher level organisms coordinating. What we're talking about here, when we talk about swarms, we talk about large groups of typically relatively what we consider simple animals, although they can be quite complex in their own way, coordinating together to solve some important task. And so a couple of examples I think may help. One is fish schooling, for example. Today we're going to talk a lot about social insect colonies, but fish schooling, you can imagine schools of anchovies in a swirling mass that looks almost like a liquid living thing all by itself, even though we know it's made up of thousands of individual organisms. And this superorganism, if you think of it that way, is able to respond intelligently to its environment and find food and avoid predators, all because the individual fish are able to exploit the fact that a fish within the organization can see the predator even if I can't, for example. And so that swarming mass occurs because each individual fish is saying, okay, I'm going to avoid the neighbors next to me. I'm going to align myself with neighbors that are further out. And then I'm going to try to move towards those that are further away. And those fairly simple movements are all that's required to create these really complex behaviors that have then been replicated by computer scientists in simple simulations. The real fish fish are more complex than that. It is still interesting to see that simple rules result in these emergent behaviors that if you were to look at any individual fish or even a small group of fish, you couldn't really see what the whole effect was. And nor does it make sense to say that an individual fish is avoiding the predator if the predator is nowhere near that individual fish, if that makes sense. Sure.
So, okay, I kind of get the idea for the predator issue, but does it help them in any other ways? I mean, termites, ants, bees, I'm not sure they have the same kind of predatory issues that the fish do.
Yeah, that's a different type of behavior. And in some ways, it's much more complex. So the fish, they're largely out for themselves. It's kind of selfish. They find food because fish that know about food go in a certain direction and get their neighbors to follow them and ultimately move the whole mass. Whereas a colony of termites or ants or bees is really engaged in an interaction with the environment and with predators, but also with food sources and maintaining their own systems at a constant period of time. So their behaviors, you could decompose them. You can think of the individual colonies as getting their own food, regulating their own environments, whether that be through construction activities or through removing waste from the colony, expanding the colony, moving and taking care of their babies, the nurseries, and of course taking care of the queen, which does not control everything. And so you have several different behaviors that each single behavior in its own is a separate swarming behavior. But this complex interaction between these behaviors is interesting because it allows them to survive as really a superorganism, which would not be possible for, say, a single ant on its own.
Well, that single ant makes me ask another question before we continue.
Sure.
In human organizations, one soldier asleep at the wheel or one driver not paying attention can screw things up for the whole group. Do individuals in these swarms really matter if they kind of stray or if they're incapacitated?
Now, one of the fascinating things about insect organizations is that the colony, with the exception of the queen, although the queen is not in charge, all the rest the organisms are basically expendable to a certain degree. You can take many of the individual ants, regardless of what their task is that they're performing, and then the individual task and the colony as a whole is generally okay until they reach, the colony was being attacked by another colony, for example, and it reached a certain critical level of, a minimum population where it could no longer perform the swarming task. Then the task itself would fall apart, and then the colony would be in danger. But that's a long way to go to take out the colony.
Okay, well, let's do a little math here. So I think we've said, or we were told that ants have about 250,000 neurons, and bees, maybe 500,000 to 1 million. And neurons are, however, kind of slow. I mean, ours are too. They're taking about a millisecond to switch. How can they have such a sophisticated behavior with such slow and limited computational hardware?
They have the same limitations and overcome them the same way that we do. So I'd like to say, I didn't study individual insect brains, but I am, of course, aware of their extraordinary capabilities. So the bottom line is that they have a really fascinating ability, just like we do, of interpreting overlapping sensory information, and the interconnections between their neurons far outnumber the number of actual neurons in their brain. And so I don't have the number on me right now as to what those interconnections look like, but in a human brain, it's billions of cells to trillions of interconnections. And I assume from observing some of these that the interconnections between the bees and the hierarchy with bees and ant brains is similarly organized like the human brain is in terms of there are structures that control other structures of neurons. And that kind of hierarchy and that kind of interconnection means that even though each individual connection is slower, they're processing more in parallel. And so good examples of, individual bees are clearly able to learn behaviors on their own. So, one interesting study is, we're going to talk a lot about bees, I'm pretty sure, because that's what my research focus really was on, was some honeybee behavior. But a worker bee only lives about 3 to 5 weeks. And yet this single bee, as it gets a little bit older in their terms, they begin doing more complex behaviors. And so a bee will remember how to get to a distant foraging site. They'll remember going to multiple foraging sites. And that's a lot to think about. This bee is flying to a distant location. They can go like that. I'm going to butcher this number here, but I know it's, you can go kilometers is what we're talking about, but they can go pretty far away and still come back without much of an issue. So they are doing their own land navigation and figuring out, how and remembering where to go and where to get back. Not to mention the fact that they also know how to transmit that information to other bees so that they can find it. So that's a lot of complexity for an individual bee, which is why it makes it so interesting to talk about what they can actually do. Yes, that.
Jason, from your research, especially the focus on bees, what were you able to draw from your study of bees in swarms for use in AI? And I have to say, when I was reading through parts of your dissertation, I was really fascinated by your comments about how bees select as a swarm a new nest site. Could you explain some of that for us?
That's definitely, honeybees are quite simply amazing. So what happened to me is I picked up Tom Steely's book, the Honeybee Democracy, which anyone who's interested in bees, and hopefully I excite some of your listeners about bees in this next few minutes here. Tom Steely spent a large portion of his life really documenting how bees thrive and how the hive works. But most importantly, in this book, he really looks at how the bees make decisions. And there are a lot of different decisions to go into, but the behaviors that I've pulled from bees, probably the most important one, their ability to choose a new hive site. So if anyone's not familiar with this, what happens is you have a hive of, tens of thousands of bees in it, and there's a queen, and at a certain point, typically when a new queen is about to emerge, the old queen the hive will emit a swarm of bees, and that swarm of bees' job is really, if you look at the hive as a single organism, this is really the reproduction of the hive. It's going to go out and form a new hive somewhere else. And so that is a well-known behavior, but what is not well-known and what was revealed in Tom Steely and his colleagues' work is exactly how that happens. So I'll focus on that behavior. Happy to discuss other behaviors too, but the bottom line is once the swarm is emitted from the hive, it sets up kind of a temporary location. This temporary location can be hundreds of yards away from the original hive, and they form this mass that some of you may have seen, just clumped anywhere that makes sense, usually like in a tree or somewhere, but it could be anywhere, in a house, wherever. And this mass really exists to protect the queen, so it regulates temperature, keeps the queen protected, but at the same time, 2 to 5% or so of the swarm is made up of these scouting honeybees. And these scouts will go, and their job is to look for and discover sites that are possible hive locations, future hive locations. And these scouts will independently go and assess sites that they find. And these sites really matter in terms of the size of the opening. If it's too big, it's dangerous because it'll let out too much heat. If it's, I think the optimal size is about 40 liters of volume within the hive. So they assess several aspects of these possible sites. And then the interesting thing is the scout that discovers it then goes back and has 500 or so of the other scouts that it has to convince of which site is best. So there's no centralized reporting procedure. So they actually start initiating this voting dynamic, really a recruiting dynamic. So an individual scout that sees a site will come back, and it will, if it likes the site and it assesses it as being a good possible hive site, it will attempt to recruit other bees to go and assess that site. And so they have a dance floor, similar to you see the dance floor in the hive, where they equally compare foraging sites when they're not in a swarm. On the swarm, when they're comparing future nest sites, there's a location on a swarm where they perform this dance. And I assume I've got time to talk about the waggle dance because it is quite fascinating. So some of you may have heard of this. A honeybee that is trying to communicate information about a location will land in this decision-making hub, or this dance floor, if you will, and it will first align vertically with the swarm, and then turn so that so at a particular degree away from vertical, and then it will vibrate its body and move in a circular motion. Well, it is what is fascinating about that dance is that the turn it makes from vertical is really the change in azimuth, the direction from where the sun is in relation to the swarm. And then the number of rotations it makes is scalable to the distance to the site location. So you have an azimuth and a distance that is communicating to other bees that are watching this, interpreting it, and knowing where to go, which to me is fascinating. And Tom Steele in his book talks about he didn't know where the scouts were going and had no idea. And he was on this island and the bees weren't going where he expected them to go. And he watched them dance and he could actually plot on a map where they were going, which is fascinating to me. So this recruiting behavior, the number of dances, how well they recruit is actually proportional to how well the individual bee assessed that site. So better sites result in better dancing, which results in inspiring other bees to go and check out the same site. The other bees will go check out the same site. If they agree with an independent assessment, they come back and also recruit. And so you can imagine this recruiting process alone is enough to start building support in varying degrees for different sites. In addition to this recruiting behavior, each individual bee also inhibits bees that it sees that are advertising other sites. And that inhibition is also proportional to the quality of the site that they're currently supporting. So if I'm bee A supporting a site, and you're a second bee, bee B, and you're doing another site, the probability of me inhibiting you from advertising your site is actually proportional to how well I assess my own site. And then this process continues until each one of the bees, as they recruit, they go back and forth between recruiting and then going back and reassessing their site. And that reassessment is fascinating because what they're really doing is not only improving their assessment of the site again, but they're also really counting the number of bees that are at that location. And when the number of bees is roughly between 20 or 30, then they've evolved this ability to, okay, that means about half of the total bees are assessing my site. And so we've got a majority, and they go back and start preparing for movement. Very complex answer. It is equally interesting problem to figure out how those bees then motivate the swarm to actually prepare and then take off and then move, thousands of meters, a couple kilometers away, and then arrive at a very tiny spot altogether, even though only, less than 0.5% of them know where they're going. So what
that answers about the first half of my question, which is
Right.
what we're focusing on. But what did you find that was useful in what you've just described for application in AI? And I have some follow-ups to that, but I want to make sure you complete the bridge that you started building.
What I was most interested in was the decision-making process itself. How can a decentralized group of agents, whatever the agents were, limited to local communication, how could they, in a self-organized manner, assess a discrete set of options and then choose between them, and such that every one of the agents in the group would then ultimately be able to execute the same action. So in my research, I was certainly inspired by biology, working with artificial agents, and these were simulated agents, by the way, and they were doing site selection assessments, and then the whole group would lift off and then travel. But the idea being twofold. One is I was exploring the decision-making process itself to see if it could be improved upon. To be honest, I think the bees have it pretty good. The models that we have so far are not perfect in terms of they're not as resilient as the bees themselves, but also looking at not just choices within, but also could these agents make a decision at all? So this is a best of n decision. In this case, if I'm assessing sites, that's n sites. If I'm assessing courses of action, that's n courses of action. And so if they can come to a consensus, that means that they have a decision-making capability in which not only are they able to assess options, they're able to choose one, and then every agent in the group knows what the outcome was, and then can, from that point, take action, if that makes sense. So
It did, except I'm still not sure that I understand how do you make use of that in an AI program to accomplish a particular task?
Let's see. So you're saying, what is how do I guess I'm not sure exactly how your question is asked then. So the AI, I'll start with this to see if it satisfies your question. If not, we can go into a dive about some of the how you would apply AI to this process to optimize it. So, for example, the early swarm experiments focused on capturing the behaviors at the individual level and then showing how those individual microscopic behaviors would cause emergent intelligent behaviors as a collective. So in this case, the individual agents that I was dealing with, that was a fairly simple, more or less simple model for the assessment and then the recruiting and then the inhibition of other options. Whereas what it had to do was nest within a collective model that mathematically converged to an actual decision. And so those are mathematical models, and it's analogous to early forays into AI. And the next step for these really is, okay, those interactions, those models, you fall prey to exploring an exhaustive search of parameters, for example, which is very hard to control. How many interactions per the quality of the site is very difficult to cleanly and handcraft. So a lot of the most recent articles that have come out about swarm intelligence, not surprisingly, are how do we go about feeding the right feature space into an artificial intelligent algorithm to define and learn that parameter space instead and improve the intelligent agents, which is a hard problem and currently unsolved. But that is the direction I see this going. I think
so. So let me just interject a question I think suggested by Roland's sort of train of questioning and your descriptions of what's going on. How sophisticated is the decision-making behavior by the individual bee that produces this emergent, rather very sophisticated decision-making behavior? I think that's sort of the thrust of your comments.
So I think obviously the models that I explored were quite simplified. So they were doing, relatively abstract evaluation of sites. If you mean the bee itself, the bee's assessment of a site is actually quite complex. So did you mean the biological assessment or the simulated videos? Yeah, I think so.
In some sense, the complexity of what you're describing, the bee is a relatively simple engine.
Mm-hmm.
It doesn't, the emergence of sophisticated behavior out of relatively simple things is what I'm sort of what I think you're getting at, and what I think Roland is trying to grasp from his questions.
So I think I'm still not sure if I'm getting there, and I apologize, but I think that in a lot of these behaviors, and this one in particular, often defining the individual complexity is actually almost a separate problem to defining the complex problem that the collective is trying to solve. And so in this case, I could track a single agent or bee, throughout the entire process, and their behaviors at any given time don't appear that, they're learned behaviors, but the collective as a whole can react to wildly dynamic environments as a result of these behaviors. So they can make comparisons between any number of, I wouldn't say any number of sites, because there actually is an ill-defined upper limit on the number they could actually assess. But they can also respond dynamically if a site is destroyed mid-decision-making process, or even if one is moved, it can be rediscovered. And that is quite complex. And the collective is able to accomplish that, even though each individual bee has really no part in that process. That is certainly.
Am I correct in thinking that you're hoping at some point to develop robots that can behave in swarms collectively the way bees do?
That is certainly what people, and myself included, was looking at is this even possible? And I think that there are a lot of, in my mind, at least in the current development, these mathematical models that are currently throughout, everyone trying to figure out how these complex behaviors could emerge from simple behaviors. That is really the first step. And then after that, I don't think we're going to get to that kind of capability until the individual agents are actually much more intelligent than they currently are. Yeah.
So Colonel Cody, listening to you put all these pieces together, and in particular, with respect to your research about the bees, what I hear you saying is that it's really focusing on looking and observing about how these animals or insects sort of think together in their real-time systems, how they deliberate efficiently to sort of converge or come together to make sort of the optimal solution for a particular circumstance that they have to deal with. I'm just curious, in your research or observations, did you ever come across any circumstances where the optimal solution wasn't achieved or observed or saw sort of any weaknesses or vulnerabilities in the way that in particular bees kind of coalesced around a particular decision point?
Absolutely. I'll start with it's funny because I always have to dance between the biological inspiration and then the simulation itself, right? So the work that I did, in his book, Tom Seeley proposed a model, a mathematical model, and then that model was initially experimented on by a gentleman by the name of Dr. Giovanni Rana, out of Sheffield University. And so he proposed, he has a model, and he's been working with this decision-making process as well. And I was working with, some of his model and then adjusting it to try to improve it. So that model alone, they won, even though it seemed to work well for bees. Clearly, we didn't have the whole story because if you play with it in simulated systems, the bees, because of travel times, would be actually influenced by the environment. So one of the big challenges with these collective systems, and I dealt with distance between sites, but you can imagine if any one of the options requires more time to assess, then what you have is you have this bias that may either be, it's a bias that would be considered a positive bias. And there's several researchers that have worked, with Dr. Anna and others. They have this bias in the environment that actually influences the decision-making process in a bad way. So the honeybees are relatively not immune to this, but relatively resistant to this problem. Whereas the individual agents, and certainly the collective of artificial agents, that first model would basically choose the closest site, 9 times out of 10, which is not really what we want if we're trying to compare the best one. And so the next thrust within this decision-making process was, how do we overcome that in a way that still doesn't destroy this behavior? And then, what kind of delay, possibly you enter distance, which is simplistic. But one of the things that I explored was having the bees adjust their behavior given a maximum range. For example, say the bees know that the artificial agents know they're not going to exceed a certain range from their decision-making location. So a swarm, they would have to, and knowing that, they would actually augment their behavior to account for that, which is tricky, as you can imagine. So the mathematical models aren't quite there yet. The honeybees are pretty good at this. The challenge that they have is how do they pick a site before they run out of internal energy, right? Because they have limited resources in this temporary location that they're living at. But in general, they're able to find and locate a new location and move to it pretty reliably. Although there are possibilities for failure in the decision-making process. There are other researchers who are looking and finding that just as the simple mathematical model is roughly analogous to a leaky accumulator model for neurons. So it's how simple decisions are made within even more complex brains. Mathematically looks very similar to how input and recruitment happens within the bees. You have one signal that is increasing in favor among other sensory inputs, and then when it reaches a certain threshold, it fires. And that's similar to reaching a certain threshold for a given site, and then the honeybees taking off. So it's rare, but split decisions are also possible. So you've got a problem where, assessing the accuracy, where the biology may be outperforming currently the agents that we have for simulated hives or simulated swarms. And then you have the very low but important risk of a group splitting off you have to guard against as well. Does that get close to what you're talking about, Alma? Great.
Absolutely. Thank you so much.
Yeah.
In doing these studies to see what you can model from swarms into AI, are there certain aspects of bee behavior that you need to put aside, even though it's optimal for the bees? I was thinking of 3 while you were talking. One is that in a particular temperature, the bees have to remain in a thermal niche, and they're burning energy to do that. A second is that they appear to have a division of labor within that swarm, and yet it's not a strict division. In other words, if certain bees are unavailable to perform certain tasks, others can do it. And then there was one you mentioned to me in a previous conversation about certain bees, worker bees, preparing a queen for the flight, where they bump into her in order to stop her from eating, in order to get her to lose weight, to make her more flight worthy, if I've got that right.
You absolutely do. It is quite amazing the number of tasks that are happening concurrently with the bees. Now, obviously, although I would have loved to have tried to model all of them, it would be really really difficult to do so. I'll start with the one you just mentioned. So all that coordination that I talked about, you notice I didn't mention the queen really once. The queen is not in charge. She has a very important role, a critically important role to play, both in promoting good behavior, but also by releasing pheromones, but also in, of course, making sure the hive survives. And I say the queen, there are other queens that get born eventually, which means that the old queen will eventually have to leave, depending upon how the rest of the hive is doing. But yeah, all this task allocation is a problem all on its own. So honeybee hives need water, right? They need water collection, they need food collection, they need to move their dead out of the hive, they need to protect the hive, they need to build the hive, they need to feed their young. All these and regulate temperature, right? All these tasks are critical to make the hive survive. It'd be difficult for me to say that that you could apply many of those behaviors, and certainly the task allocation behavior makes a lot of sense if you were trying to create a complex artificial swarm where you have some agents doing some one activity and other agents doing another. That may make sense, but I think it only makes sense in a situation where you have one of the critical features of all these insect colonies is that have a centralized decision-making hub. And other researchers have proposed this, and Dr. Rain, as I mentioned before, used it in his, and I use it in mine. Because in order to share information, they have to actually be communicating together. I used a physical space, but as long as there's a way for them to communicate, they have to actually share that information. So if that information sharing isn't happening, not only is it hard for them to dance and recruit for foraging sites or future nest sites, there's actually also no ability for them to sense which tasks are important. So the task allocation, what I do next, matters. So the behavior that you mentioned and I neglected to is when the queen is getting ready, when everyone's trying to get ready to go in terms of emitting the swarm, the queen hasn't been flown in quite some time. And so the scouts, when they start assessing that it's time to move, and that time to move is task allocated too. It's related to the density of bees within the hive. When it gets to a certain population level, it's time to go. And so they start preparing the queen by basically forcing the queen to essentially get flight ready, lose weight. They bump against her and make her move around and don't let her rest until she's ready to go again. And then when she's ready, that's one of the signals, although I'm sure there's others, to get them to emit the swarm.
So you've demonstrated that swarms pursue their own needs and interests and do so building up from individual behaviors into a collective. As a military officer, and without taking you into anything that you're actually working on, theoretically, does a human need to give a drone swarm direction? Does the swarm develop intentions of its own? Or is there some hybrid in the operation as people start working on either military or dual use applications of these swarming behaviors in very small, very large numbered robots?
Yeah, that is, of course, that's a great question. In terms of where does the human and how does a human exert their control? In terms of do they need to tell the swarm? Right now, where we're at with current technology in terms of swarming behaviors, it would be very difficult to see. I currently don't see any publicly available information about swarms that are able to do anything more than move in a coordinated way together. I can keep agents. I can give a direction to a swarm of UAVs. Cutting edge technology is like, let's get the swarm to go from this location to this location, not run into itself on the way, for example. So we're not at the point yet where they're making more complex behaviors. But I think if in terms of what giving a swarm direction and giving an intent, I'd say hybrid, because I can think of situations where it would make sense for the swarm to be very tightly controlled, and then others in situations of moving away from people or away from in a communication denied or contested environment where it needs to operate more on its own, more together without direct human control. I think that so does the human need to give the drone swarm direction? Right now, certainly. Right now, I don't see anything happening where a swarm can do much on its own reliably. In the future, as they get more complex and are tested more, that could change. But I don't think we're there yet. Would you like to ask a follow-up? I would like.
No, that you hit that one. Thank you.
A follow-up disclaimer, by the way. I know Charles is about to chime in. I apologize, Charles, for cutting you off, but I will say I'm not working on any of these projects right now, and so this is just me keeping tabs on what's been going on out there that anyone can look up and applying what I've done for part of my research to it. So sorry, Charles, go ahead.
No, fine. So I'm teaching a course here at Dartmouth, and we're currently looking at cognitive computing, and of course, autonomous systems or swarms thereof has come up. And of course, the students wander off in all directions about what you might do with swarms. And of course, there's always a few that start thinking there might be military applications. So if we ever, despite the arguments of whether AI, really strong AI is around the corner or around the century, if we beat that, if we're able to do the AI thing and imbue some level of intelligence or at least autonomousness in these drones, let's just imagine, what could you imagine these AI drones could do particularly in a military application?
Sure. I always like to start with some of the applications that aren't military, but I don't mind
Sure.
military ones. So, it's interesting. Some of the colleagues of Dr. Reyna, he had done a lot of the site selection stuff, a lot of this decision-making process, which is great. And others have worked on things ranging from agricultural. So imagine artificial ants or bees tending large fields in ways that would be difficult for a human to do. So, you can imagine a swarm of, harvesters or a swarm of, and when I say swarms, these don't have to be like tiny little robots. They could be swarming, but large enough to do interesting or important things in agriculture, from pest control to weeding to to harvesting. And I think if your listeners were to Google and check it out, there's stuff that it's that people are looking at for that. It's been postulated. Marco Dorgo is one of the fathers of the swarm intelligence movement. He's one of the authors of the book in the 1990s book, Swarm Intelligence. And he recently talked about, hey, what's the future of swarms? And from a non-military standpoint, he also threw out, in addition to military aspects, search and rescue missions and ecological monitoring, where swarms really are or could be amazing. I can't say they are amazing because they're not there yet. Where they could be amazing, a place is where you need persistent surveillance for any reason, whether that be environmental monitoring, and I'll go in a minute how that could have obvious implications, at least in the near term, for military engagements, because you could have a large area covered by a large number of cooperating agents that can monitor and share information. And even groups of these agents that may perform some of this decision-making process that I mentioned previously, that may help them improve the visualization of I said battlefield. Could be agriculture too, though, right? So if from a military aspect, absolutely, your students are right. If you look at sci-fi, pop culture is full of all kinds of references. Anyone who's watched Black Mirror, which has a B episode that don't let the kids watch because it's kind of scary. There's lots of horrifying images out there. What I think about when I think about, and this is just me, when I think about it, is I think early on, we're going to be enabling the eyes and ears of land, sea, and air forces. So imagine you have a swarm of agents that are essentially being escorted by a larger agent, whether that be on land or sea or air. And there's lots of advantages to just that behavior. It may just be swarming with some very simple behavioral commands, but that one agent, whether it be a soldier or any other any of the other services, still exerts a fair amount of control because those are close proximity. But the advantages could be significant in terms of pushing out their own perimeter, so that the engagement area is pushed out away from the actual individual military member, and also can see a larger area potentially. And of course, if they are weaponized, they'd be very useful not only in traditional attacks, but also if engaging other swarm agents, for example. Again, speculation because we're just not there yet, but that's one area. I also rolled in a separate conversation once. We also talked about the possibility of them being used to surveil urban areas, which is still a hard problem for soldiers. If you have a swarm of bee-like robots, for example, that you let into an urban area just to look and then maintain surveillance of an urban area, one of the challenges now is if you clear a building, then you got to continue to watch it forever. All right. But if you leave a swarm of agents there, you can be alerted that something has changed. And that's another important application for it. Surely you can also imagine, coordinated munitions as well, which is, obviously more kinetic and brings up, I'm sure, other questions.
Swarms. One of the things that you're suggested to me is totally unmilitary, but one of the challenges we have with recycling is that most of our stuff ends up in the trash dump and it's all mixed up. Much of it can be recycled if we could only separate it, but we can't separate it practically. But imagine a large swarm of little robots that aren't very powerful, but just good enough to tell glass from metal, from paper, from food.
Yes.
And then drag pieces to different places.
Yeah.
And it doesn't really matter that they're slow and stupid because we have plenty of time.
Yeah. It's funny you say that, Mark, because when my advisor is Dr. Julie Adams. She was at Vanderbilt University, but now she's at Oregon State University. And she's continued a lot of this work, largely focused on how humans interact with those things. But I'm laughing because early on we talked about it. That was precisely the application I was interested in when we first started talking about coordinated movement. I then moved on to decision making, but I 100% agree. There's other research out there that similarly is long, slow process, but widespread to evaluate infrastructure decay or evaluating eroding pipelines and things like that. If you're looking at monitoring the infrastructure for whether it be the electrical grid or pipelines or railways or roadways, that's a lot of work for people. And you could decentralize it and cover it without using very expensive, hard to manage individual robots.
I had a couple of questions on challenges to human swarm interaction. And one of them is the way you've been talking, you've taken a piece of swarm behavior and you've studied that. And somebody else has taken a piece of swarm behavior. And we sometimes talk about, AI as being like the great elephant that everybody has, a sort of different grasp of. But when you're dealing with something like a swarm, which is acting as a system, are you really able to abstract usefully from a piece of it and ignore the rest of the system?
Larger challenges with swarm interaction is if I am piloting a single robot, for example, if I'm a member of a team that's trying to drive a robot, I'll have an interface that shows me where that robot is moving and status updates of what that individual robot is doing. That is, of course, important for me to predict what it's going to do next or identify when something's going wrong or know the state of the system. It's pretty easy because I'm watching it. I think that when you're looking at a collective I'll pause for a moment and explain why I keep using the word collective versus swarm. So to me personally, and this is not held throughout the field, but really, you can have swarming behaviors like things like fish schooling or even bees moving together in a group. And to me, that's different than a collective acting as one organism. And so, the honeybee hive is more like a collective organism. So sometimes you'll hear me say collective making a decision. The challenge there is if I watch one agent and that's all I've got, it's really hard for me to predict what the rest of the swarm is doing, what the rest of the agents are doing. So one of the big challenges with human swarm interaction is how do I shorten the time it takes for a human to look at the swarm or at least an interface with the swarm? What do I need to show the human so that they can quickly discern what that collective is doing? So in my own research, I was a simulated environment. They were watching collectives move within an environment and the humans involved in the study. And you could see that there is a significant cognitive effort that occurs when you're trying to figure out how these complex systems and what they're going to be doing. And depending upon the awareness of, if you brief the human, I think you can reduce it if the human understands the decision-making process, because then they can more quickly articulate what they think the swarm is doing. But it takes a period of time that's larger than observing a single organism or single agent that's operating on its own. It takes longer to figure out what the swarm is doing. And so another parallel area of research, it was continued by one of my colleagues in this particular problem, but through many other problems in terms of swarm, because in spatial swarms where they're moving together, you still have the same problem. If I can only see part of the swarm, if I see one fish or a group of fish, I don't know what the whole thing is doing. Same with one agent and multiple agents. And so, Dr. Adams and some of the following colleagues, some of the other colleagues, Karina Roundtree, one of them that picked up the work and published, and she was focused primarily on, how do I get to this transparency? What kind of visualization techniques can I use to make it clear to the operator, to reduce that overhead? Because you can imagine that trying to predict the one robot is hard enough, and then how this robot's interacting with other robots and what they might be doing together, even though they're not doing that activity now, that's a lot of overhead. You can get there with interfaces, but that imposes their own challenges. Hopefully that gets closer to some of the challenges that are out there. There are actually, others, and we can go into them now, or I can wait. But in terms of that, all feeds into how much do I trust the system, right? How much confidence do I have in it if I don't know what it's doing at any given point in time? And then if the swarm operates well on its own, how complacent am I if it's done well so far? And I have to be able to recognize anomalies. I think
Charles has a couple of follow-up questions he wanted to ask from an earlier topic that I jumped over, and I apologize.
No problem. It's all fascinating. Well, okay, back to my lunatic students. They really took off on this. And so, one group was saying, well, is it realistic to talk about swarms of, military drones or police drones or, crowd control, whatever you want to, however you want to arrange it. But is it realistic to talk about those in terms of a human still in the loop to handle CNC or command and control up until the time it's obvious what they have to do? Because the point that I raised in class was the whole goal here is fast, light speed, and slowing it down for a sort of mother may I, it's defeating the purpose. And then a follow-up with that to be, if you're trying to herd cattle, that's one thing. But if you're trying to herd other drones who are acting at the same speed you are, oh golly. Mm-hmm. Is any of this realistic?
I think it is with abstraction, right? So I think it is likely catastrophic to a swarm if I were to try to take control of any one or even a group of agents within the swarm. It would because they are making the interconnections between. If you imagine just a three-dimensional cube, a space, in the air with 50. UAVs flying around, unmanned aerial vehicles flying around inside that space. There aren't any human. There are not even 50 humans could keep those things from colliding into each other. And it would, so you have to rely on the swarming algorithm itself. So for individual agents, and there's many levels of this, and I'll get there. But this first one is, for some behaviors like coordinated movement, there are certain aspects of the behavior that I doubt would ever be in control of each individual agent's movement. That would be, one of the biggest goals of swarm intelligence, and I think you alluded to it, is, currently we have, 1-to-1 ratio between human to robots, and that's not even really true. We actually have many humans to one robot in most cases, especially if it's a sophisticated robot. And clearly, if I have a swarm of 50 agents, I can't possibly afford to have, hundreds of people watching 50 agents. And so what swarm behaviors let you do is let you reduce that ratio. So if my behavior is simple enough, and I'm just basically, I've got an interface where I'm giving waypoints and I'm saying, okay, this swarm is going to go from point A to point B, it makes sense for me to be in charge because I'm sending a swarm in a location where I've told it where to go. And I've given it a destination, but I actually don't. I may be able to, depending upon how far away I am and what my communication capability is, I may be able to still abort said mission and have them come back. But I'm not telling them. I may not even tell them how to necessarily get there, and certainly not how to fly, how the individuals fly and coordinate to get there, right? Because that would be very difficult to manage those interactions. So if you imagine a hierarchy of these behaviors. The mother may I question, I think, is more relevant as you have more complex behaviors that they're capable of. So if I can assign a mission or a task to a swarm and just have it go take care of it, I'm assigning the task, but not the individual agents and telling them, maybe I'm telling you how to get there. So that's where the mother may I makes sense. If you're talking about, imagine two swarms slamming against each other, for example. So Paul Sharia, of course, in his book Army of None, talks about one of these experiments, and everyone should read that book, in my humble opinion, because I think it does a pretty good discussion about, certainly better than I'm going to do, about what's out there now and what could be happening in the future. But it talks about some basic swarm on swarm behaviors, and clearly that kind of a massive agents fighting each other would be very difficult for any human to control. Yeah.
Thank you. That was great.
Jason, let me go back to the thread that I was on before now, on challenges to human swarm interaction, and then a question having to do with why swarms instead of humans. You mentioned that it's hard to have a human observing lots of drones at one time. Would it be possible, for example, to have AI tasked with observing and predicting where the drones were going to move, so that you wouldn't be relying on the limitations of human cognition to master something that needs to be done that rapidly?
I think another colleague who's looked at this, not a colleague of mine, but a colleague of Dr. Adams, is Dr. Mike Goodrich out of BYU. He did some looking at how could we better predict what this coordinated behavior is doing based on number of observations. Like, how many observations does it take for me to know what a moving swarm, like what formation the swarm is taking, for example? And so you could use, once you're talking about inputs or sampling of different agents, then you are looking at a possible AI problem to help resolve what the state of the organization is. So, for example, rather than carefully handcrafting an interface that guesses at or tries to articulate what a collective might be doing or a swarm might be doing, you could try to train an AI to assist in that, assist in that interface with the human, right? I think what you're getting at is, could I delegate to a separate AI agent to control, say, an individual swarm? I see you nodding, so I assume that's what you're actually getting at. I'm of course focused on the human swarm interaction. So I think that's there are several directions that this could go. So if I'm thinking about a sprawling farm with multiple swarms doing multiple tasks at once, it may make sense for me to have, whether it be self-organized or separate agents that are keeping tabs on what the overall swarm is doing. I won't say I'm in the sci-fi realm, but I'm definitely not in the near term in terms of capabilities. But I think it's not out. I think it's in the realm of possible. The challenge, there's lots of challenges that come up though. Anytime you see that kind of observation power, is that challenges to with AI everywhere else, which is, what's the training data look like? How well do we test it operating in, real environments? How much do I trust without seeing what that AI is feeding back about the swarm? And honestly, I don't have a good answer for that, and I certainly wouldn't trust a system without seeing extensively tested in the actual environment it would be operating in at this point, because they just aren't. The behaviors aren't resilient enough for me to throw it in an unknown environment and expect it to act well. Yeah. So.
And I know this is going to sound rather strange near the end of a discussion of swarms and of insects and bees and their behavior, but why do you think it's more useful to look at swarming insects as a model for AI rather than collective human behaviors? I mean, humans don't necessarily swarm, but there are crowds, there's crowd behavior, there's mobs, there's mob behavior. Maybe they're not as intelligent or as functional, and maybe that's why you want to go to swarms. But could you tell us why you found that it was more useful to go to insects for the model rather than humans?
So one of the it's interesting because one of the challenges with using human swarms, right? I had a bit of an existential crisis, honestly, when I started studying this, because when you start thinking about superorganisms, then you start thinking about cities as colonies, and you start thinking about, our own movement behaviors and how, a lot of what we do is also self-organized, and it makes sense. Humans have an incredibly complex way of interacting. And so I think that, certainly there's been studies not in this area, although there are some where there, movement within individuals moving like a mob moving, for example, or if you look at anyone who's, watched the New York subway or moved up and down the street, we have these little behaviors that we kind of take for granted that dictate how we move with relation to each other. Different cultures have different, social space that they're comfortable with. And that's, when you think about it, it's kind of like swarming. I joke when I walk with my colleagues, if someone bumps into us, I'm like, yep, swarming, I'll even broke, because that's what it is. But part of the reason why insects are valuable is because typically their interactions are a bit more predictable. They're a little bit more regimented, meaning that, a honeybee swarm, this honeybee hive, and this honeybee hive, and this one, they all typically have similar behaviors that they've evolved over time that are observable and repeatable in experiments. And that may not be true of humans because there's so many ways of communicating and different ways of interacting. One of our big strengths is the fact that we can actually change how we interact with each other. Whereas a single honeybee colony, although there are individual changes between the members, or individual differences between the members, largely interact in similar manners. So I would love to pull that thread of different individuals, but we can get there if we have time. Humans.
Right. Well, I was thinking of some of the ones we've talked about in the past, the behavior of people on 9/11, where everybody started walking north, or the chaotic behavior in collective, if you will, of refugees from a war zone in a train station trying to escape.
Certainly interact, and humans certainly swarm. I personally believe, and this is not backed up by any research, and so belief is a bit of a strong word, but you think about it, swarming can kind of happen on multiple levels. So the honeybees, right? They have these swarming behaviors, but they also have this swarming of of information sharing, right? So I have one of the members of my PhD committee actually. I found out as we were going through it, had also studied the honeybee decision-making process, but in terms of social belief propagation, which is fascinating. Obviously looking at insects, but also looking at how ideas propagate.
Yes.
And the insect gossiping models that are out there, how they share information. You could say, I wouldn't say it's exact. I'm not calling us bugs, but I would say that it's interesting. That's how insect colonies share information by essentially gossiping. And the interaction rate and the which agents interact, clearly affects how information makes its way through the colony. As far as, I'm not aware of any swarm intelligence studies that use humans, partly because humans are so complex. And I think that really is what it comes down to. I think that's the factor. I think you could do pedestrian movement studies. You could do optical flow analysis of, camera feeds of people moving and come up with similar movement and behaviors. Just walking down the street, in America or in New York City, for example, there's kind of some unspoken rules about how we behave, and I'm pretty sure you could model those too. The differences, I think, the differences between us are more pronounced because we are more complex and have longer lives and more learned behaviors than say 3 to 5 week old bee. So I think.
So I guess it's time to wrap up, but let's look in the future directions of inquiry. Where do you think if we were looking for the beef, so to speak, where would we look?
That I think I've indicated before, first of all, the handcrafted mathematical models, which are valuable for trying to figure out how these behaviors might work, are not useful in dynamic environments. We definitely have to figure out ways of learning those behaviors, whether that be some kind of genetic algorithms or doing deep learning, trying to solve the problem of how do I learn an interaction behavior in a dynamic that work for at least several different types of similar environments in a way that will result in the desired collective behavior is a significantly difficult problem. And Marco Dorgo proposed this in his recent paper where he projects forward a little bit, and I totally agree with him. In there was a swarms conference in 2017 in Kyoto, and there, one of the things that we all talked about, and Marco Dorgo was there, as was Nigel Franks, who I have to make sure I mention because he's done a lot of work in swarm intelligence. Heterogeneity matters, even in insect colonies, and part of what makes these colonies robust and dynamic is the differences. Even though it'd be easy to say they're all the same, it's the differences. So now you've got the problem of, okay, can I make a swarm of agents, a swarm of robots, where they have these individual differences that as a collective improves their ability to make better decisions or have better behaviors? Hilarious. I'll leave you with one that was great. I was listening to a study about lazy ants, and yeah, some ants are lazy. They're totally lazy, and they don't work when everybody else is working. And what is the point of these lazy ants? They're just eating food. Come to find out, they're a latent quick reaction force. They only get engaged when everybody else is tired. And when you think about it, that's a fantastically evolved tactic for keeping the colony alive in times of distress. Thank.
That's a great finish. It also reminds me of teenagers. But with that, wow, this is fun. It's really cool to get to hang out with you again and to hear what you've been doing since the last time I ran into you. Thank you so much for your time and for doing this work and answering our crazy questions. This has been wonderful. Thanks you very much.
Thank you very much. I enjoyed it.
We thank the Business Law section of the American Bar Association for their generous sponsorship of the production of this podcast. We welcome questions and comments from listeners. Send email to comments@mindthegapdialogues.com. We read all comments and questions and will try to respond in the letters section of a future episode. If you are writing about a particular episode, please do mention the specific episode number. Please also do include pronunciation tips to help us properly say your name when we reply in a subsequent episode. See you next time on Mind the Gap Dialogues on AI.
Thank you for listening to the ABA Business Law Section's podcast series, To the Extent That. The section offers a robust collection of content. To explore more about this topic, or to learn about joining the section, visit ambar.org/bizlaw. That's BIZLAW.